All right, good morning, everybody. I'm excited to have you here with me this morning on a Friday. Luckily, hopefully we're all wide awake after some coffee this morning. This morning, we're going to talk about a topic not often discussed. We're going to talk about how we can unlock the potential of college and high school programs, most commonly referred to in Colorado as concurrent enrollment for students with disabilities. My name is Carla Phillips-Kravickas. I am the Senior Advisor at KnowledgeWorks, and I am the CEO and founder of Think Inclusion. And my mission there is to partner with public and private sector leaders like yourselves to ensure that students with disabilities are included in every policy, program, and initiative. The College and High School Alliance is a group of folks that gathered in about 2015 to try to develop a common agenda for college and high school programs. It was really formed to respond to ESSA, in which they were successful to get about 15 provisions put in that law. But in 2017, they formalized and continued the work, and you can see KnowledgeWorks is a member of that alliance. The Alliance in 2019 adopted some core principles and goals to close equity gaps. That was really the focus of their work. And in that same year, they released the report that you see here on your screen. And it is a state policy roadmap that was really geared for the National Governors Association back in that time. And it really gave state policymakers over 20 recommendations and a roadmap that they could follow to ensure that they were developing equitable programs. But interestingly, as that work has unfolded since 2019, they started partnering with states and developing supplemental resources. It became really clear that a resource was needed specifically geared for students with disabilities. And I am proud to announce that our report that I authored will be coming out next week. So it's almost hot off the presses. You're going to get a sneak peek of it today, but November 16th, it will be released. And it's going to look exactly like this, except a different picture on the front, but it's really a supplement to this report. So if you're familiar with this one, you're going to see in a second it has the exact same format as this one, again, intended to work in tandem. Before we get too far down the road, because I always acknowledge, especially in a group like this, that we may have a lot of folks who aren't very familiar with special education, especially on the K-12 side. So I like to start with what I call Special Education 101. So one thing that I like to point out is if you look at the three big chunks, specific learning disabilities, which includes things like dyslexia or dysgraphia, speech language impairment, kind of self-explanatory, and other health impairments, which would include something like ADD or ADHD. Those three combined are almost 70% of the entire special education population. And I think a lot of people find that surprising, because often we have kind of myths in our head of who's in special ed, typically a child with Down syndrome, autism, hearing impaired, visually impaired, but 70% are what I call invisible disabilities. If these kids were walking around on campus, you wouldn't even know that they had a disability. And I want to qualify for this report, we defined special education students as those that are receiving services under the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Act. And that's important to know because for this purposes of this report, that does not include students who have 504 accommodation plans. The other thing I would like to point out is that intellectual disabilities, you can see the big red arrow up there on the right-hand side, highlighted yellow, is only 6.45%, which as you can see is less than 10%. So think about that, and that's our primary disability. There may be a few others, but generally speaking, it is safe to say that at the max, maybe 10% of students in special ed have a cognitive impairment. So if you think about the reverse of that statement, that means about 90% of students that are receiving special education services should be achieving on par with their peers if they're getting the services and the supports that they're entitled to. A lot of people find that surprising, which also means that the achievement gap that we always refer to, for the most part, shouldn't exist, except for maybe a small sliver of students. As we started down this road and I started doing the literature review, I noticed that I couldn't even find any reports that even included data or disaggregated the data that they had for students with disabilities. So we partnered with our friends at the Community College Resource Center, and delved into the Office of Civil Rights database, and this is what we found. And before I go too far, I want to admit that we fully recognize the limitations of this database, of which I won't go into now. If you talk to your K-12 friends, I'm sure they will tell you. But we really wanted to start the conversation. And on a national level, this is all we have. States have different data. But generally, what this statistic tells you is that even though students served by IDA make up 12.7% of the total K-12 population, they only represent 3.9% of students enrolled in a dual enrollment course. And that represents an 8.8 percentage gap in representation. So that's a significant gap. It's a big disparity, right? And you can see it here most clearly. This is the chart taken out of our new report coming out next week. And you can see on this particular chart done by subgroup that it really confirms our suspicions that students with disabilities are the most underrepresented student group in dual enrollment. Again, I use dual enrollment in this report. We know concurrent enrollment is the term used in Colorado. So please forgive me if I use those terms interchangeably sometimes. And we also did this by state. So we know that gaps exist in every state. It's pretty good, as you can see, that Colorado's on the far right-hand side of that. So it tells me that there is a gap, but it is smaller on a national scale. And we also know that access to college and high school access itself is inequitable. As a result of the data that we received for this report, we've kind of developed this new term, and we're calling it being shut out. So what this means is that students in special ed have been shut out at over 37% of schools nationwide, secondary schools or high schools. These are schools that, one, enroll students with disabilities. So they had some students with disabilities in there, and they offer dual enrollment coursework, but didn't have any special education students enrolled in those courses. So I'll let you stew on that for a second, because I know that the data is a little hard to process. So if we have, I think it was 2,100 high schools we looked at nationally that had students with disabilities and offered coursework, 37% of them didn't have any students with disabilities enrolled in those dual enrollment courses. And this too, we ran nationally. So you can see the average right there in the middle is 36%, and Colorado is right next to it. So not great, but right around the average of what we see nationally. And it's a small group of us, so I want to let there be a certain amount of informality. So if you want to jump in and take yourself off mute and ask a question as I'm going through, please feel free. I want this to be interactive. This is only the second time I'm presenting this. Like I said, since the report just got finalized last night. So any questions or follow-ups would be more than welcome. So this is the original report in 2019 that I alluded to. And you can see what I call the 6 policy buckets: equity, goals, and reporting, credit transfer, finance, course access and availability, instructor capacity, and navigational supports. Those are the 6 policy buckets in which the original report was written. So they had recommendations under each of those buckets and state examples. My report is going to follow the exact same format. There'll be recommendations under each one of these and state examples. And I have over, I think, 24 of each of those, which is a lot. So today I wanted to kind of give you my high-level takeaways. And one of which is that states should have an inclusive vision. State policymakers should review all policies to ensure students with disabilities are intentionally and explicitly included. And this sends a clear message to the schools that you're encouraging and expecting participation of these students in these programs. And it's interesting, and I want to kind of pause here for a second and talk about, if you've been in education the past 2-3 years, we all know that equity has been a hot button, and rightfully so. But it's interesting that students with disabilities are more often than not excluded out of equity conversations. Although in my opinion, students with disabilities really embody the descriptors of historically disadvantaged or historically marginalized. In fact, as I often point out, my daughter, who has Down syndrome, I didn't even have the right to attend a public school until 1974, almost 20 years after Brown versus Board. And this particular takeaway is really about the lack of the dearth of data that I found nationally. We did a 50-state scan, and we found very little data, even though they were mandatorily required under ESSA to report some things. Every place possible, there was very little data. And data-driven conversation should become the starting point. And I know it seems overly simplistic, but as I delved more into this topic that you guys live, eat, sleep, and breathe, it was very clear that there's a lack of clarity over the current participation rates at the state level, what the unmet need is, and if students with disabilities are succeeding in these programs, right? And those are really the three data points that we need to be able to have a productive conversation. I am looking in, comments to make sure. Again, I'm trying not to check Kyle, so if you have a question, please take yourself off mute and jump on in. I also want to tell you, and I should have told you a little bit more about myself at the beginning, and I apologize. I've been doing education policy at the state level for about 25 years. Arizona is my home. I've worked at the state legislature, the governor's office, the State Department of Ed, and one of our universities. I've been involved with national nonprofits about 5 years now. And one of the things that's really become clear to me, and myself included, is that even over all these years, when we say all means all really doesn't always mean all. Or all isn't assumed to be all, or folks aren't even aren't safe to assume that all means all. And that's why I'm really pushing hard lately on being intentional and explicit. I'll pause for a second if anybody has any questions. I have a state example here for you. The Kentucky school report cards, they do disaggregate their participation in dual credit programs by student subgroups, including students with disabilities. The data also reports the number of enrolled students, completers, and the number of students with a qualifying grade. That's a lot of really great information, I'm sure you'll agree. Which of course is why they're a spotlight state. Another really interesting example I found was the Illinois Model Partnership Agreement. Some states would call them the MOUs, Memorandums of Understanding. They contain a provision in there that discusses how the parties, being K-12 and higher ed, can ensure the exchange of data in compliance with FERPA. So let's talk about data for a second, right? In K-12, we know, because it's required to report to the federal government, we know how many students with disabilities, what kind of disabilities they have. We know a lot about them, and it's reported annually. In higher education, the only data that you really have is the number of students who voluntarily register, right, at your disability resource center or whatever your campus calls it. And we know anecdotally and nationally that that number is probably dramatically underreported. We know a lot of students don't want to register. They want to kind of let go of that stigma. So I want to tell you about something interesting happening here in my home state, is that the Board of Regents was annually producing a report where they took the graduation cohort of a given year, partnered it with National Clearinghouse data, and produced this amazing report that basically told us if any students in that graduation cohort went on to post-secondary education and where they went anywhere in the country. And it was disaggregated by all subgroups except for students with disabilities. This year, we have the data, they just received it, and we're gonna have that for students with disabilities. So if you think about the power of that data, assuming it works, is that we will be able to know, in theory, every student who had an IEP or an individualized education program in high school, if they went on to higher ed and where they're at. That's really, I think that there's a potential of having a game changer effect here, because again, we'll be able to actually compare that number to the number of students that are registered and see what the unmet need is, right? What I also want to point out, and we talk about this in the report, that the RISE Act has been introduced in Congress 2 years in a row. And this would actually tell the states that whatever documentation was required to qualify for IDEA in K-12 would also qualify for ADA requirements in higher ed. And that would remove a really big obstacle for students, right? Because I know oftentimes they have to jump through more hoops when they get to higher ed. But I also want to say something a little provocative. And we say it in the report, there's nothing stopping states from doing that now. because there's nothing in law that requires that. So states could take it upon themselves to enact that via statute, via regulation, or just even school policy to really remove another obstacle for students. And I didn't even think about this when I was doing this slide, because it's literally something that's been coming up a lot recently, is there's this kind of myth that students with disabilities have almost a higher expectation of privacy. And I literally have that question out to an attorney right now, because I don't know of any other requirement outside of FERPA. So as I was telling a partner recently, my son, the privacy expectations or rights of my daughter is the same as my son. So I just want to mention that in case that's something that you've heard of or you've wondered. I'm not aware of any. If you know of any, please let me know. But that has actually, again, been an obstacle for states to exchange that data or to have these kinds of conversations, is because they're unsure, which is why I think the Illinois example is powerful, because you're saying, okay, if you're going to come into this partnership agreement, that's got to be one of the things you guys got to iron out. So here's my big idea for this one. And again, this is in the report, is you can challenge the idea of who a qualified student is. So you have two examples here. Ohio actually allows for a waiver of a program requirement. And one of those requirements could be eligibility, if the goal is to improve access for underrepresented student groups. And we just saw from that data that students with disabilities are certainly underrepresented. So in Ohio, they could utilize a waiver to do that. And in Massachusetts, in the disability community, has really one of the programs that everybody talks about. It's called the MACI program. And it is in statute, and it's legislatively funded, by the way. And it's the Massachusetts Inclusive Concurrent Enrollment Initiative. And I think I should know this number. I think it's on over 20 campuses in Massachusetts, where they actually have transition programs for students with intellectual disabilities. So these are students that typically would not qualify, but they've created this new program to allow them to leverage those transition years under special education to prepare for post-school life. We have a question, Wendy?
Yeah, I put in the chat, maybe that was your response regarding no other expectations of privacy. So within the students with disabilities, there's no expectation of HIPAA rules applying to sharing information between the high schools and the colleges?
Thank you. By the way, everybody just jump in and raise your hand, because I'm trying not to check chat. I can see the screen.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Yes, but they're equal. Is what I'm saying is, I don't know of anything in her FERPA or HIPAA that says there's a higher expectation for students with disabilities than any other student group. So in other words, I was having a conversation with another state recently, and they were telling me about this kind of online program they had developed for college and high school program, but they were concerned with privacy for students with disabilities. And I said, if this system, the software that you've created, is built to meet all FERPA and HIPAA requirements, and she said, absolutely. I said, then I think that's fine. There's no higher level. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Does that answer your question? If you find anything different, please let me know, because this has literally come up again just this week with another state I'm working for, this kind of idea that.
Yeah, no, I am not nearly as well versed. So I am tentatively saying yes, because I want to go back and reread what I have read to make sure that I understand that theoretically a high school that has an MOU with a college and is working within those FERPA allowances, where the line is that they can share with us that a student does have accommodations, whether that's just a simple yes or no, or whether that's, going more into detail. That's kind of what I'm trying to sort out.
Well, obviously I would always say defer to your attorney and not me. But I know, again, it sounds like some of these recommendations sound, again, overly simplistic. But one of the things I like about Illinois is that the law is saying you have to have this conversation. If you're going to enter in a model partnership agreement, have that conversation and put it in writing over how you're going to handle that issue.
Right, exactly.
Thanks. All right, big idea, challenge qualified. My second big takeaway, let me ask this to the group. What do you guys think that Colorado can do to expand access to concurrent enrollment for students with disabilities? Does anything come to your mind? Jennifer?
Yeah, I was thinking that, speaking as someone with a disability, what they could do, especially in our state for college selectives, teaching students about how to self-disclose, because obviously that's not something that they have to do in high school versus you have to self-disclose in college.
Yes, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a few more slides. But yeah, that's a really big deal because the expectations for students and families is dramatically different in K-12. And I have a son who just turned 18 2 weeks ago. So and he does not have a disability, but I'm already seeing this shift, right? Because now he's an adult and he's supposed to call the doctor and he's supposed to do all this stuff. And there's a big change that happens on the parent side as well. And typically for a lot of these students, like I am with my daughter, I am her primary advocate at school, but once she turns 18, unless other legal options kick in, it shifts to her ability to self-advocate. Thank you for mentioning that.
Sure.
Yeah, work closely with the Access Office to ensure that every student has easy access to the services. Codify the practices in the MOU. Yes, that's a big one. Some of the states that I see that we're doing some of the best work, honestly, it's just embedded in their MOUs, which I like. I mean, in theory, I probably prefer that it was in statute that those things were required to be done, so you knew everybody was doing it. But the fact that they're embedded in some of the MOUs tells you a lot of the mindset of those schools. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on. My second big takeaway was to have an explicit design. And so that means that state and school leaders should design and implement these programs and policies as a strategy to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. Compliance is only the starting point. We want improved access and success. This is a really big deal because so we have data and goals, right? If we did the first step, that I iterated, we have data and we have some goals. Now, how do we design with access in mind or have to go back and fix? Many states require that all students are notified of these programs. I'm not completely convinced, but I got to, I'll be digging deeper with some states, including Colorado, to make sure the students with disabilities and their families are getting those notifications. And are they playing a role in those annual meetings that special educators have to have with their parents? And I'm not sure if anybody here is familiar with IEPs. I don't want to assume. IEPs are called individualized education plans. The student who qualifies for special education services in K-12.
Hi, this is Nicole.
What's that?
Hi, Nicole. This is Stephanie Minho from DCC, just returning your voicemail.
I'm sorry, I think you're.
So the student I'm working with is Sarah
Stephanie,
Berry.
I think you want to go on mute.
Date of birth 11/2/03.
Stephanie, you might want to go on mute. Let me see if I can.
She got it.
Yeah. Before she said anything private. This is a core issue, and I'm assuming that most of you here are on the higher ed side. I don't know that to be true, but it was really interesting to me that there's this implicit understanding that IDEA governs K-12 legally, federal law, and ADA covers higher ed. And if you look at this, like the Venn diagram, right? Concurrent enrollment is literally where the two overlap. And I read over and over again on state websites that once it becomes a college course, that the IEP no longer applies. Now, I will tell you there are OCR findings to the contrary. There's a pending lawsuit in Kentucky from a parent to the contrary, but I don't want this conversation to be anything about the law, because all federal laws, including IDEA and ADA, are just floors. They're not ceilings. There's nothing preventing a state or school from going above and beyond to do what students need to have access and success in these programs. If there's one takeaway I hope people get from my report, it's that, is that let's not get bogged down in compliance arguments. Let's get down to the business of figuring out how we can identify the students who need help and how do we get them the help that they need to succeed, right? One of the, transition. So under federal law, there is, if on the K-12 side, if they have an IEP, when they turn 16, they have to have transition goals and transition plans, which is amazing, right? It needs to be based on their own interests, needs to be about college, career, independent living, measurable goals. This is probably the most underutilized lever that I can think of, because in theory, concurrent enrollment should be that bridge, right? Going to the original comment while learning how to advocate, if students with disabilities take a concurrent enrollment course, that literally is the trial run, right? It should be the bridge to that. That while they still have the support of K-12 educators, administrators, kind of that safety net underneath, this is how they can take the baby steps to learn how to navigate the higher ed environment, which is another reason why I think we should really be maximizing their participation, especially as part of their transition plans and programs. And it's interesting because some states, again, have exceeded federal law. Federal law says that these plans should start when they're 16. I think it's 23 states have passed laws that say transition plans for students with disabilities should start at 14 or freshman year. And interestingly enough, very recently, so recently I didn't even change the report, Florida just passed a law and became the first state to take that down to age 12. So at age 12, we're going to start talking about how they're going to transition after school. I want to give you a couple of interesting state examples. So in Rhode Island, schools that offer dual enrollment, have to be in adherence with the statewide dual enrollment policy. And that policy basically says that students with disabilities receive whatever the law provides. In the case of dual enrollment, it's the post-secondary, because every state uses terms differently. But basically, if it's on the college campus, the ADA rules. If it's on the high school campus, the IEP rules. Again, I'm not advocating that. What I'm saying is that Rhode Island has at least taken that other step to try to clarify. People can debate whether or not that's the right policy, but they've made it very clear in their statewide dual enrollment policy that this is what we're expecting, and kind of clarifying the myths that are out there. But the one that really is amazing is Minnesota. And I'm going to let you go ahead and read that for a second. That's pretty bold, isn't it? Minnesota law says, no, post-secondary institution has to provide whatever's in their IEP. One of the other myths that came about during my research on this project was, and I'm jokingly referring to the myth of the rogue accreditor. I heard quite a few times that there was concern that if accommodations and modifications went too far, that accreditation would be in jeopardy. I have yet to find any examples of that happening. And I'm a little hesitant to think it's true, only because if that were true, Minnesota's law would be a big problem, right, for all the institutions in Minnesota. And I'm not aware that it is. Again, I'm not advocating specifically that this is what Colorado should do. I'm going to be partnering with Colorado policymakers over the next probably 6 months to do a landscape of what everything is in Colorado. And hopefully, you know, as a state, we'll discover what's right for your state. I'm using the Minnesota as an example of a state that went above and beyond federal law to clarify what services and supports that students with disabilities should get. Oh, thank you for clarifying. 15 or by the end of 9th grade in Colorado. Excellent, thank you. And Lily, it sounds like you've heard that from higher ed as well. What are the big questions that you think exist out there regarding enrollment for students with disabilities? Lily, would you mind expanding on what you've heard said?
Sure. Just because I've been working with a disability access services partner at a community college. And so we've been kind of talking through these gray legal areas or unclear legal areas. And just that the concerns are that, that if certain accommodation, that if modifications were to be put in to play by the community college instructors for students with IEPs, for example, that would then maybe like violate their HLC accreditation. Is that kind of what you were referring to before? Yes, it's a big concern, so that there is a feeling on the community college level that they want to make sure that their accreditation is in place and not being violated by making what would be considered modifications at their level for a student with an IEP. So yeah, that's just definitely something that we've had discussions about.
When I used to work on a different issue in K-12 that I won't bore you with right now, I used to have this really great graphic, and I called it the myth of the rogue auditor. The school districts were always concerned that the state was going to come and audit them on some funding issues. And that, to be frank, there's reasons that they would be worried about that. So I'm not completely downplaying those concerns, but I've now moved to the myth of the rogue auditor. I haven't met anybody who's actually heard of that happening, but I don't want to say that it wouldn't. But again, it just seems to me that if that were really the case, Minnesota would have a really big problem, don't you think?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't heard about Minnesota, so thanks for presenting that data. It's really bold.
It is, and I'm not going to lie. This is the second time I've included it in a presentation, and I'm a little hesitant because I know it probably raises concerns on the higher ed side. And again, full disclosure, I used to be, a lobbyist for university too, so I get that. I feel like it's just my job to pose some big questions and let people know it's okay to question that. It's okay. Let's not assume. Again, because if our goal is to raise our attainment rates for all students, right? And if we get some data that shows on your campus or your area or your state, how low those attainment rates, let's let that be the focus of the conversation rather than what the law says or what the accreditors might think. What do we need to do for kids? And then after we think what we know, then we can go to the HLC or go to the state or whatever and get clarification, right? Any other questions that you think educators and administrators have regarding concurrent enrollment for students with disabilities that need to be answered or clarified?
One of the things that I've heard mentioned when I've talked to high school professionals is for some students, there are different graduation requirements and how concurrent enrollment may or may not help with that, affect that. Like I don't have a current student right now that relates to, but that is part of that larger conversation as well.
That's interesting. Can you talk about that a little bit more? So if they have a separate diploma, like I know there are a lot of states, Arizona is not one of them, that have almost a separate diploma for students with disabilities. Is that what you're thinking?
I have not had the chance to look at that difference. Jennifer Maxwell may know. I just know that was part of a conversation that was being had in a call that I was on, but it was mentioned. That wasn't the topic. So that's not something that I have yet to be made familiar with yet.
Okay. I
So
appreciate
in Colorado, at least as far as CDE goes, all students must be able to access all graduation requirements. So there are no longer any differentiated diploma types. But one thing that we've run into, and I've bugged Gail and Robin about this recently, is that there's some CDE funding language that says that year 5 students, unless they are an Ascent, are not eligible for concurrent enrollment funding. And a lot of our special education students, you know, have to take additional courses, you know, in their regular schedule, traditional schedule. And so they don't necessarily have as much time to access concurrent enrollment until they are a year 5 or in a transition program. And so we're trying to like kind of navigate that. I feel that feels pretty inequitable to me. So we're trying to figure out the specific language and how to be able to fund those students so that they can have somebody kind of walk with them from K-12 as they kind of navigate their first courses at a college level.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. That is a big issue. I've heard that in one other conversation in Colorado. So for those of you not familiar with the K-12 system, again, there's that idea of that transition planning or those transition services. And often, especially for students with more significant disabilities, those requirements and plans will require an extra year. So under, I think, federal law in every state, there are students, you can go to school if you have a disability until you're 21 to make sure that you've gotten all the services that you were entitled to. But thank you for raising that. That's huge. Wanda, did you have a comment?
Nope.
Oh, okay. All right, let me move on. Third big takeaway, third and last, is supportive guidance. Again, this sounds so simple, but there's a lot of room and it's quite easily the easiest thing a state can do. And Colorado's actually done a pretty good job. I've seen some really great FAQs on your State Department websites on students with disabilities and concurrent enrollment. So that's a big, big step that puts you above most other states. But again, it's not even just the practical issue of clarifying how the funding can be used or not used, which is super important. But the fact that you even have these guidance documents on your website and available sends a really clear message that we expect students with disabilities to enroll in concurrent enrollment, and we're encouraging it, right? So that's a really good one, especially now. So if you think of my 3 big ideas, right? The first one is data. We need to identify these kids, quantify the issue or the gap. And the second one is let's iron out access issues. And now at the end, what do they need, right? So we need guidance on the range of programs, services, and funding streams that can be used to support students. So the issue that you just brought up of that funding in year 5 is a perfect example of why an FAQ would be needed to clarify this. And oftentimes an FAQ will also raise that issue to the policy level, like the legislature or the state board, and say, okay, we've identified this, we've done this FAQ, but we probably need to fix it. And last, I want to point this out. So again, this report is a national report. And I fully recognize that the policy levers each state's going to pull varies based on their political and policy environment, right? So some states may do more things in statute, some do more in regulation, like under the board. Some states utilize guidance documents. All states have cooperative agreements. I should say every state that I'm aware of requires some sort of cooperative agreement between K-12 and higher ed for these programs. And so again, those are some low-hanging fruit that you can really embed some of these great policies to help support students. Oops. And I have some examples. So Florida law requires in the articulation agreement that you're iterating the services and resources available to students with disabilities. So again, when K-12 and higher ed is negotiating those agreements, this is one of the topics that they have to tackle. And again, that's in law. Pennsylvania, on the, I think it's the State Department website, has a dual credit toolkit that recommends that MOUs address these issues and determine responsibilities. Really important language, right? Who's going to be in charge of this? And of course, who's going to have to pay for it too is another important one. I thought this was so cool. The state of Washington had a special dual credit equity grant that districts could use to create, to fund efforts to eliminate equity gaps and students with disabilities would qualify. I know oftentimes there may be concerns, right, for who's going to pay for the extra services and supports these students might need. It's worth noting that on the US Department of Ed's website, they have some guidance on when and how the K-12 special ed funding can be used, federal funding can be used for these. But I thought it was really cool that Washington put out a special pot of money to say, okay, let's be innovative. What do you want to do to eliminate your equity gaps? See, I had a Colorado example in there, which is great. Arkansas's concurrent enrollment policy specified, and this is the only one I found, that a policy for the faculty had to have a policy for students with disabilities. So what do you guys think Colorado can or should do to improve access and success in current enrollment for students with disabilities? I've tried to give you some, hopefully some exciting examples from other states.
Maxwell and I will be talking about this in the next session, but I think a big part of it is just more communication from everyone. From the high school counselors, from the school that's partnered, like the higher education institution that's partnered with that high school. I like what you said, and I wrote down even the counselors and caseworkers on campus, just everybody saying it to everybody. One of the things that I've been saying for a while is we really need to appreciate the students with the disabilities to the same degree that we talk about targeting other audiences who are often missed or marginalized. And so I think whatever we're doing in those spaces, we need to think about doing equally in abundance for our students with disabilities.
Agree. I know you're probably all familiar with the Colorado Rises. I think it's your 60% by 2030 goal. Even in that report, I wasn't able to find any mention of students with disabilities. And again, it's not meant to be a criticism, because honestly, I couldn't find it in any of those states. Almost every state has what I call the Lumina Foundation goals. And it's not a criticism, but it's rather intended to be a suggestion, right? So as states are really striving to achieve those goals, in Arizona, we call it Achieve 60, is 60% of students with credentials by 2030. Targeting almost 13% of your K-12, that's a big bucket of students that we can be working with and supporting to help attain those big statewide goals. Any other thoughts?
And you probably already heard this. I think you've already met with Jimmy Youngblood from DPS on my team. But we've created MOUs with all of the community colleges that we partner with at DPS. And so we have kind of like an auto-approved accommodation transfer. So we've worked with each accessibility center to determine which kind of like one-for-ones would be acceptable from the IEP to the college course, if it's being held on the school. And so I think that helps clarify what is allowable for everybody. It's a new process, still got some kinks, but.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. How new is that?
Sorry, I'm trying to park while I'm doing this. The days we live in. So we started it with CCD about the Community College of Denver about 3 years ago. And we've had all of them up and running for probably about a year, but it was a weird year. So, so this year is really, I would say, like our first full year of running it through. And we, because we want to scaffold the learning of the student having to take the initiative of going to the accessibility center and, advocating for themselves. If they enroll in a concurrent enrollment class, they get a pre-populated email that gets sent to them, their case manager, and their teacher that says like, hey, you enrolled in concurrent enrollment, or your student did, or your child did. And they are eligible for accommodations. Make an appointment with your case manager to receive those. And so we kind of place the onus on the student, but give them the little nudge of reminding them to do it.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I have a high school student. They all need a lot of nudges.
Yeah, they get a few.
I'm sorry, what was your name? I missed your name.
Katie Kraft with Denver Public Schools.
Yeah, I'll probably follow up with you. As you can see on this screen. So Colorado, the Department of Higher Ed and K-12 has partnered with me and KnowledgeWorks to do a deep dive in Colorado. So I'm really excited to begin in this work. And so, Kay, I'd love to follow up with you and get copies of that MOU. That sounds like a great example. And one of my next steps, probably try to get it started before the holidays, but it'll probably kick in earnest in July, is to have some stakeholder conversations, almost kind of focus groups. So please email me, let me know if you're interested in participating publicly or privately. If you've got concerns, issues, things that we should know about and you want to discuss them privately, either way, please let us know. This is intended to be for and of Colorado, so let me know what you can do. I should put my email address here. I should apologize. It's Carla with a K at thinkinclusion.org. Carla with a K at thinkinclusion.org. Although, you know, Carl, Tammy, all these guys that are working for CDE and CDH, know how to reach me as well. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. And I hope you guys all reach out to me and engage with me during the next 6 months as I try to kind of do a landscape analysis of Colorado and facilitate some recommendations moving forward.
Thank you so much, Carla.
No problem. It's my pleasure. This has been such a fun project. I thought I knew a lot about dual enrollment. I think I know a lot about special education, and this kind of intersection has been really eye-opening for me and really fun. So I'm looking forward to the deeper dive with Colorado.
All right, well, that concludes our session. So everyone, please make sure that you complete the session evaluation that's at the bottom of the conference agenda. And thank you again, Carla. Thanks for a little sneak peek into your report.
Hot off the presses next week. You can follow me on Twitter at @thinkinclusion, think_inclusion is my Twitter, and we'll be putting it out there next week.
Excellent.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.